Hey, welcome everybody. It is so good to have you here today, whether you're joining us online or attending in person at one of our three locations. No matter where you happen to be right now, I'm so glad that you've set aside this time to reconnect with the heart of God. Well, this week we're talking about change and how to navigate change in our lives. Because here's what I know that change can sometimes be difficult. Because we all go through life with certain expectations about how life is going to play out for us. We all have plans and hopes and dreams, but then sometimes things change. And we realize that those plans and dreams may never become reality. Our expectations about life, they don't always measure up to reality, and that can be really frustrating. Let me give you some examples. These are just fun examples. Let's say you decide to take a vacation this summer and you're going to go to the beach. And you figure, while you're there, you might as well build a sandcastle. And so you have an expectation for what your sandcastle is going to look like. You have a picture in your mind, something like this. But then the reality looks more like this. Or maybe you had certain expectations about what parenting would look like for you. And when you began the parenting journey, you had an image in your mind of how your kids would behave. And this is what you pictured. But then reality looks more like this. Or maybe you decide to do some cooking for your family. So you go online and you find an idea. Your goal is to make these bunny rabbit pancakes. A special surprise for your kids. This is what you expected to make, but then reality looks more like this. See, the truth is, in life, sometimes there's a pretty big gap between our expectations and our experience. And we can laugh at those examples I showed you, but then other times, it's no laughing matter. Maybe you had great hopes and dreams for your career, but now you're in your 40s or 50s, or even in your 60s. And you never expected that you would be job hunting at this point in your life. Or maybe you're a parent, you had great expectations for a son or a daughter, but that child of yours is now on a path that is so far from what you had in mind for them. Maybe you thought you'd be married by now, but you're still eating dinner alone every night. We've all felt that gap between what we expect and what we experience in life. And when our experience in life doesn't live up to what we expected from life, we can become disappointed and discouraged and sometimes even despairing. See, frustration lives in the gap between expectation and experience. And we've all been kind of living through this over the past 12 to 15 months, haven't we? Looking back, none of us expected that an unseen virus would put our lives on hold for months. We didn't expect to be rationing toilet paper or wearing surgical masks to the grocery store or homeschooling our kids for a full year. None of us expected that. None of us expected that our nation would become so bitterly divided by racial differences and political differences. And the truth is, these past 12 to 15 months have left a lot of people just feeling drained and frustrated. And the fact is, as we look to the future, there are more changes on the horizon. I know that's true for me personally, and as a result, that's going to be true for us as a church. The fact is, change is a non-negotiable in life. Life is just unpredictable. So, what do we do when life doesn't measure up to our expectations? What do we do when our experience in life doesn't match what we expected from life? I think it all comes down to one thing. It comes down to perspective. We have to choose in that moment to change our perspective, and that's what I want to talk about today. And today, as we talk about perspective, I want to focus your attention on a passage of Scripture in a book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes. Now, Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. Solomon was one of the kings of Israel, and he was a man of great, great wisdom. And so this book of the Bible is a collection of Solomon's observations about life in this world, and how to have an eternal perspective on life, how to have God's perspective. Here's the opening line of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where we're going to be today. It begins this way: "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven." And what follows after that is one of the best known passages of Scripture. anywhere in the Bible. You may have heard someone read the words that I'm about to read for you at a wedding or a funeral. Or if you're over 40, there's a tune that starts running through your head whenever you hear this passage of Scripture. Because there was a group in the 1960s called the Byrds that turned these words into a hit song called Turn, Turn, Turn. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a reason, turn, turn, turn. That song was number one in December of 1965, which makes it, by the way, the only number one song in history with lyrics written by God Himself. And it's interesting that even though millions of people know the words of this passage, most people don't really understand the meaning behind it. So let me just give you a one-sentence summary of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. I would summarize it this way. I can't choose my season, but I can choose my perspective. I can't choose my season, but I can choose my perspective. And you know, sometimes the biggest problem in our lives is not the problem itself, but it's our perspective on the problem. And in those seasons of change, in those seasons when life doesn't quite measure up to our expectations, we have to make a choice. We have to choose to step back and see that season from a different perspective, from an eternal perspective, from God's perspective. Okay? So let's jump into Ecclesiastes chapter 3. In the first 8 verses here, there is this fascinating poetic description of what life is like in this world. Let me just begin by reading through it. It goes like this. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. And so Solomon gives this list of 28 different life experiences, 14 pairs of contrasting life events. Let me just go back and talk through them. He says there is, first of all, a time to be born and a time to die. And by the way, those will be the two biggest events of your experience here on this earth. And both of them are pretty much outside your control. We don't choose the day we're born, and except for extreme circumstances, we don't choose the day we die. That's just the way it is. He goes on to say there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. You know that landscaping you just put in around your house? Someday somebody else is going to tear that out and plant what they want. That's just the way life is. He says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. There are times when the police will use a gun to stop a dangerous criminal. But if the criminal survives, that same criminal will be taken to the hospital where doctors will fight to save his life. There's a time to kill and there's a time to heal. That's just the way life is. There's a time to tear down and a time to build. That home remodeling project you just completed, someday somebody else is going to come along. They're going to tear out what you built and they're going to remodel it again. That's just the way life is. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. You know, you have children and they make you laugh. But then one day they make choices that cause you to weep. And that's just the way life is. There's a time, it says, to scatter stones, like when you need to clear a field and plant a crop, and a time to gather them, like when you need to build the foundation for a barn in which to store the harvest from that crop. He says there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There are times when someone will put their arms around us and comfort us, and there are other times when they will take us by the shoulders and look us in the eye and tell us to step up. That's just the rhythm of life. There's a time to search and a time to give up. There are going to be times in life when you're full of hope and you will keep searching for whatever it is, and there will be times when you will have to give up hope and stop the search. And that can be a painful decision, and that's just the way life is. He says there's a time to keep and a time to throw away. In other words, to put it in our language, there's a time to put stuff in the closet and there's a time to have a yard sale. Some of you have clothes that no longer fit and they probably never will. There comes a time when you just have to let go and just embrace the future and buy something with elastic. Okay, there's a time, it says here, to tear and a time to mend. Guys, there's a time to mend your favorite sweatshirt and there's a time just to tear it into rags and use it to wash the car. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. And one of the most important skills in life is knowing when to do which. There's a time to love and a time to hate. You might say, wait, is it okay to hate? Well, if you love God, then you must hate sin and hate injustice and hate the causes of suffering in this world. And if you hate evil and you love good, then there will be, in this last phrase, a time for war and a time for peace. We don't need to be violent. We don't need to be lovers of war, but we also should not be naive. In a fallen, broken world, there are times when force is needed to bring about justice. There's a time for war, a time for peace. That's just the way life is. And in these first 8 verses, Solomon is just giving us a poetic description of life in this world, the extremes of life. He's reminding us that life, whether we like it or not, is a combination of good and bad, positive and negative. I mean, think of this list in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, kind of like a list of ingredients that God mixes together to serve His purposes in your life and in my life. Let me try to illustrate what I mean by that. Here's a list of different ingredients. And if you read through that list of ingredients on the screen, you see that some of the ingredients on that list sound really good, like sugar. Who doesn't like sugar? Or milk chocolate chunks, or even eggs. Eggs are good for breakfast. But then there are other ingredients on that list that don't sound very appetizing at all. Like you would never say to somebody, hey, we'd love to have you over to the house for dinner tonight. We're going to have some flour. Or you wouldn't say to your kids, have a great day at school, honey. I packed you some vegetable shortening for lunch. Or you've never said to yourself, you know what, I'm really hungry for some sodium pyrophosphate. See, a lot of those ingredients on that list are not very appealing on their own. But here's the thing. If you take all those ingredients and you put them together in just the right way, here's what you get right here. You get a Chick-fil-A chocolate chunk cookie. I did not say a chocolate chip cookie. This is a chocolate chunk cookie. And it's from Chick-fil-A. So it's a Christian cookie. I mean, these are my favorite cookies, 350 calories of awesome flavor. Now, individually, the ingredients that make up these cookies are not very appealing, but if you put them together in just the right way, then the combination of the good and the bad create what is beautiful. And my point is that God can do the same thing with all the ingredients of our lives. Every sorrow, every tear, every hurt, every joy, every blessing. It all goes into the mix to bring about something really good in the end. But here's the thing. We don't always like that. We wish sometimes that this was like a multiple choice thing. You know, if we could choose from that list that Solomon gave us in the first 8 verses, if we could choose, we would choose only the good stuff, only the pleasant stuff. Like a time to be born, yes, please. A time to die, no, thank you. At least let it come peacefully when I'm well past 100. A time to plant and a time to uproot. I'll take the planting. A time to kill and a time to heal. Definitely going to go with the healing. A time to break down and a time to build up. I like building stuff. I'll take building up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. I think I'd like to laugh until I weep. I like that combination. A time to mourn and a time to dance. I'll take the dancing, but not too much. I grew up Baptist. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. I think I like gathering better. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. I'll take embracing, but in moderation. I'm not a very huggy kind of guy. A time to search and a time to give up. I don't like giving up. A time to keep and a time to cast away. Definitely keep. A time to tear and a time to sow. I'd rather things be repaired than torn. A time to keep silent, no thank you. A time to speak, yes, because I like to be heard. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. I'll take love and peace. See, if I could choose what I wanted, I would choose all the good things and none of the bad things. None of the things that hurt me. None of those things that bother me or stretch me. Thing is, though, God loves me too much to let that happen. You see, people who are never stretched, people who never hurt, people who never mourn, they usually turn out to be very shallow, self-centered, spoiled, rotten kind of people. Like, I've never met anyone who likes to eat flour, but I know a lot of people who love chocolate chunk cookies from Chick-fil-A. But you don't get the cookies without the flour. And none of us will become the people God is calling us to be without some unpleasant ingredients in our lives. Years ago, I came across something called A Letter to My Grandson by Lee Pitts. And now that I have a grandson, this is even more meaningful. But I love what this guy wrote. He wrote this: "My dear grandson, we tried so hard to make things better for our kids that we made them worse. For my grandchildren, I'd like better. I hope you learn humility by being humiliated, and that you learn honesty by being cheated. I hope that you learn to make your own bed and mow the lawn and wash the car. And I really hope nobody gives you a brand new car when you turn 16. It will be good if at least one time you can see puppies born and your old dog put to sleep. I hope you have to walk uphill to school with your friends and that you live in a town where you can do it safely. If you want a slingshot, I hope your dad teaches you how to make one instead of buying one. I hope you get teased by your friends when you have your first crush on a girl, and when you talk back to your mother, I hope you learn what ivory soap tastes like. May you skin your knee climbing a mountain, burn your hand on a stove, and stick your tongue on a frozen flagpole. May you feel sorrow at a funeral and joy during the holidays. These are the things I wish for you: tough times and disappointment, hard work and happiness. To me, it's the only way to become a man." It's a wise grandfather. And that's life. There will be good times and there will be difficult times. There will be laughter and there will be tears. Some days you feel like the windshield, some days you feel like the bug. There will be success and there will be defeat, and God can use all of it to make us into the people He is calling us to be. And what we need to do is we need to see our seasons from God's perspective. And Solomon writes this in the book of Ecclesiastes. Is very interesting because he goes back and forth from a heavenly perspective to an earthly perspective to help us understand the difference. And he goes on here in verses 9 and 10 to describe earth from just an earthly perspective as if God is not there. He says this: "What do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race." In other words, if God isn't part of the equation, then what's the point? I get up every day and I work hard, but everything I'm building will eventually be torn down. I arrange my life in a way that brings me happiness, but then something falls apart. I invest my time and effort in relationships, but then something goes wrong and my heart gets broken. I mean, what's the use? See, Solomon he's just being honest here. He's saying if you don't factor in God, if you just look at life from a strictly earthly, under-the-sun human perspective, then life seems very random. It can feel like one big cosmic slot machine. You get up in the morning and you pull the handle and you just don't know what you're going to get. And that's a pretty hopeless way to live. But honestly, that's the way most people live, which may help explain why there is so much anger and depression in our culture today. But then in verse 11, Solomon turns a corner and gives us an eternal perspective again. And this is so beautiful. I love verse 11 of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It says, He, God, has made everything beautiful in its time. Like, believe it or not, God has the ability to take all the things on that list, the good and the bad, the painful and the joyful, the times of weeping and the times of laughter. God has the ability to take all of those things and bring beauty out of them. And as verse 11 continues, it kind of describes the tension. It says, He, God, has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. There's a fascinating phrase in the middle of verse 11 there. It says that God has set eternity in the human heart. That's so true. Deep down in our hearts, we know that we were made for something more. There's a voice that whispers from within every human heart, and it tells us there is more to life than just this life. No matter who we are, there is this longing in our hearts for eternity and perfection, a kingdom where good things never end and bad things never are. But here's the difficulty. We have that internal sense of eternity, but all we can see is right now. It says He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, and yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Do you see the tension here? Our hearts tell us that there's something more, and yet our minds can't comprehend how it all fits together. We just can't see the bigger picture. Think about it this way. There's an art form that became popular about 20 years ago. It's something called a photo mosaic. And a photo mosaic is a picture that is actually created by assembling a whole bunch of smaller pictures. Let me show you an example of a photo mosaic. This is a picture of Abraham Lincoln. But if you were to study it and look more closely, you would see that the image of Lincoln is actually a collection of smaller images all put together, images of people and events that were part of the Civil War. And some of those images are great heroes who fought for justice. Other images are scenes of destruction and death, some very bright, some very dark. The artist took all of those smaller images and put them together to create the bigger picture. But here's the thing. There's no way you would ever be able to figure out the bigger picture if all you do is focus on a few of those snapshots. You have to step back. You have to zoom out. You have to get the right perspective. And here's the thing. Some of you are ready to give up. You're ready to give up on God, and you're ready to give up on faith. Because all you can see is the individual snapshot that's right in front of you. Because on the human side of time, we don't have the ability to see or comprehend how this painful thing right in front of us can be part of something beautiful. And I understand that. I've got my own list. I can tell you 2 or 3 things right now that, even though I am years removed from some of them, I have no clue how those things could ever possibly be beautiful, ever. And God is saying, that's because you're too close. You can't see what I see. I see better than you, because when I don't see a moment. I see all of the moments, even the ones that have not yet happened. And so you're going to have to trust me. I am not, God says, I am not the thief that has come to kill and steal. I've come to bring life, and I am making everything beautiful in its time. And here's the challenge. You and I, all we have are these few short years of our existence. And God may be making everything beautiful in His time, but most of the time we can't see how. And the longer I've been a pastor, the more adept I've gotten at saying 3 simple words. I don't know. I don't know why 7-year-old children get cancer. I don't know why drunk drivers kill innocent people and walk away from the accident unhurt. I don't know why godly couples who would make great parents can't have children. Well, other parents who have children abuse them. And the older I get and the longer I follow Jesus, the more I realize there are a lot of questions that will never be answered on this side of eternity, but I can be okay with that. I can be okay with that. because I know that there is a God who sees what I cannot see. I love what Timothy Keller wrote in his book, The Reason for God. In this book, he writes at length about suffering and evil, and he says this. He says, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in this world, then you have at the same moment a God who is great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue, reasons that you can't know. See, I believe that there is a God who can bring beauty out of the little pieces of our lives, out of all the seeming randomness. So what do we do? What do we do when life does not measure up to our expectations, when everything around us seems to be changing and we can't control it? What do we do in those seasons of life? Look at the last two verses here in this section. Solomon goes on to say this, I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. And this is the message of Ecclesiastes 3. That there is a time for everything, and those times and seasons are in the hands of God. And so Solomon says we should eat and drink and enjoy life, knowing that our lives are in the hands of an eternal God who sees beyond the individual ingredients, who looks beyond the individual snapshots and sees the mosaic. See, we can spend so much time looking back and regretting what's happened to us, or so much time looking ahead to the future and being anxious about what might happen to us, that we miss the opportunities for joy and goodness that are given to us every single day. We must not let what we cannot control keep us from enjoying what we can. You know, someday a doctor may look up from his chart and tell me that he found something in my body that shouldn't be there. Or maybe someday a car will cross the yellow line and hit me head on. Or I may just grow old and wrinkled with my wife by my side, and our grandkids will come over and we'll spoil them rotten and send them home to terrorize their parents. And that will be a good thing. I don't know how it's all going to play out. I don't know what the ingredients of my life will be. And the truth is, I don't have a lot of control over that. But today I can love my family, I can enjoy the beauty of this day, and I can serve Jesus with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. You see, I cannot choose my season, but I can choose my perspective. Now, maybe you're here today and this is very personal to you. Maybe this is pretty raw because you're living through some of those negative things right now. You're in a very tough season. And I know that some of you have stories that I would have no answer for. And a lot of that is just going to have to be chalked up to mystery. But today, I hope you can hear the voice of God whispering to you and saying, I know it stings, I know it hurts, but find peace in knowing that everything that's happening right now has gone through my hands. Keep praying, keep running to me, and please believe that it's in my hand. And here's the great thing if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Christ. There will be a day when we stand next to our Savior and we look back through the list of ingredients that made up human history, and we'll stand next to Him and see how the individual snapshots came together to create the mosaic of history. And in that moment, we will confess that indeed God has made everything beautiful in His time. As we wrap up today, the band is going to come back and lead us in a powerful closing song that reminds us that the only true source of joy for us, the only true source of peace, it's not found in our expectations being met. Joy and peace are found in knowing that our lives are secure in the hands of the one true